Elvis Presley's family has many interesting people and tales. They come from the South in places like the Carolinas, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Life was tough for both his mom's side, Smith family, and his dad's side, Presley family. They struggled a lot and didn't have much hope for a better future. They lived in a time when cotton was the most important thing in Mississippi, but when that changed, it took a long time for something new and great to come from there. Before Elvis, things didn't look too good for his family. Having land could have made a big difference for Elvis's family, the Smiths and Presleys. They had chances to own land, but they often lost it. This led to them becoming poor farmers without their own land. They struggled a lot in a very poor state. If only they had kept the land. Like the quote from Scarlett O'Hara's father says, "The land is the only thing worth working for, fighting for, and dying for." Elvis's ancestors didn't know that giving up land again and again would mean that Elvis would live in many different homes when he was young, and even in government housing when he was older. Poverty can be passed down from parents to children, just like wealth can. Elvis's great-great-great-great-grandfather, Andrew Presley Jr., bought land in South Carolina just after the United States declared independence. He fought in the American Revolutionary War and knew George Washington. But he couldn't read or write, so someone else wrote an account of a battle he was in for his pension records. Later, Andrew Jr. moved to Tennessee and asked for land because he was a soldier in the war. He got the land but passed away soon after. His 4 sons, including Dunnan Presley, Elvis's great-great-great-grandfather, were left behind. Dunnan traveled through different states and tried to get land in Georgia but didn't succeed. He had a son named Dunnan Presley Jr. along the way. Elvis's family, the Smiths and Presleys, moved to Mississippi around the same time, between 1850 and 1870. They faced hard times because of a war that didn't go well for the South. Dunnan Presley Jr., Elvis's great-great-grandfather, was part of this war. He joined the Mississippi Cavalry twice but left both times, being called a deserter. He fought for a short time and earned some money, but then left his family behind in Mississippi to avoid being caught. He had done something similar before the war, leaving a family in Tennessee. Dunnan Jr. got married 4 times but never divorced any of his wives. When he died, he didn't have much, just $23, which was less than what he had a few years earlier. He didn't have a stable life and was very poor. Elvis's aunts Rosella and Rosalinda, who lived in Mississippi, didn't benefit from their father leaving behind a horse and belongings. They grew up in difficult times after the Civil War. Mississippi had a hard recovery during Reconstruction, especially because many people there were black. The state was divided, and it took more than 11 years to go through 2 phases of Reconstruction. The war had caused a lot of damage, and many farms were in bad shape. People owed a lot of money, and the state took away a lot of land because people couldn't pay their taxes. By 1880, people in Mississippi had very little money, with an average income of just $82 per person. Rosella Presley had 10 children with different fathers, but she didn't talk much about it. She lived in Mississippi and didn't share who the fathers were. Her daughter Robbie remembered it was a mystery when they were kids. Rosella kept her personal life secret and called her children Presleys. One of her sons, Jesse D. Presley, was the grandfather of Elvis Presley. If Rosella hadn't kept her secret, Elvis might have had a different last name, like Wallace, Hussey, or Steele, which were names of men thought to be possible fathers to her children. Being a single mom of 10 kids who were sharecroppers was very hard. Their mom, Rosella, had to give half of their crops to the landowner in exchange for a small cabin to live in. After harvesting the crops, they had to move and find a new place to live because they didn't make enough money to pay off their debts. In Mississippi, landlords could take the crops as payment for any debts. So, Rosella had to borrow supplies and necessities for her family, using the upcoming crop as a promise to pay back. If the crop didn't cover the debt, they would be stuck in a cycle of not having enough money. After the Civil War, a system called sharecropping started in some places where big plantations and slavery weren't common, like in northeast Mississippi where Elvis's family lived. In 1900, half of the farmers in Mississippi didn't own the land they worked on. Many white and black farmers were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. In sharecropping, the landowner gave the land, animals, seeds, and fertilizer, while the workers, freed black people and poor white people, did the work. They would split the crop. In tenancy, a farmer rented the land and used their own supplies to grow the crop. They could make different deals with the landowner. Rosella's son Joseph said they lived very simply as sharecroppers, with no extra money to save. Rosella, who didn't have much education, still made sure her children went to school. Jesse, Elvis's grandfather, left school early and got married when he was young. He had 5 children with his wife Minnie Mae. Jesse worked many different jobs and moved around a lot in Mississippi, Kentucky, and Missouri. He was a sharecropper in the summer and a lumberjack in the winter. At one point, he even owned a house and land, but he sold it. Jesse and Minnie Mae had some problems in their marriage, and they ended up getting divorced. Jesse moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and married a teacher. When looking at old records of people in Elvis's family, they often said they were renting instead of owning their homes. The Smiths and Presleys mostly rented and didn't have much chance to buy their own farms. Both families had chances to own land, but they lost it over time. This meant that they were stuck in a cycle of poverty and couldn't save enough money to own their own farms. Elvis's great-great-great-great-grandfathers, Andrew Presley Jr. and Richard Mansel, were from South Carolina and fought in the American Revolutionary War. This shows that Elvis's love for his country had deep roots. The story of Elvis's mom's side, the Mansel side, started with Richard's son William Mansel. He lived in Tennessee and later moved to northeast Alabama near the Mississippi border after fighting in 2 wars with Native Americans under Andrew Jackson. His wife, Mourning Dove White, was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. Intermarriage with Native Americans was common in the South. They moved to a new home given to William by the U.S. government, but it was taken from the Chickasaw Indians in a war. Many of the first settlers in Marion County, Alabama, where they lived, were with Andrew Jackson when he passed through in 1814. They took the land after they finished serving in the army. A man named William Mansel got a piece of land with 40 acres and a little more in a place called Hamilton. His family, including 3 kids Mourning, John, and James, seemed to do well there. Sadly, Mourning Dove, the mom, passed away when James was born. John, the oldest son and Elvis's great-great-grandfather, took over the farm. He had a lot of children, some from his marriage to Betsy Gilmore and some from a relationship with her sister, Rebecca. It was common for people in their family to have more than one partner. Eventually, John left Alabama with his 2 wives and many kids to go to Mississippi. The trip between the 2 places now takes only 45 minutes, but back then, it meant leaving behind the chance to own land and moving towards poverty. They became sharecroppers, which didn't lead to a better future. John went to Saltillo, Mississippi, to see his son White Mansel, who was living on his own land. When John left his family, White took charge of them. John went to another place and changed his name to Colonel Lee Mansel. This decision led the family to struggle a lot. After the Civil War, families were very important in the South. They helped each other survive and relied on each other a lot. People lived close to each other and knew their neighbors well. Traveling far away was not common. Families often married each other, including cousins, because it was the best or only option. Elvis's great-grandfather, White Mansel, had a big family to take care of, including his daughter Doll, Elvis's grandmother, and another relative and Mansel, and later married a neighbor named Obey Smith, connecting the Mansel and Smith families. And Obey had 7 kids, but they didn't have a stable home, and left Obey and moved to Richmond, Mississippi with her family and some others. They all worked together on a farm called Hussey Farm, sharing the work and the land. The Mansel/Smith family, like the Presley family, became sharecroppers. In the 1890s, there was an economic depression, and bad weather and too much cotton made farming really hard. Owning land made a big difference, and those who had it were better off than those who didn't. In the South, before cities and factories became important, land was very valuable and people had to work hard to keep it. But sometimes, even hard work couldn't protect them from things like the economy or the weather. And Mansel Smith and White Mansel were important family members. They lived close to each other, and their children grew up together. 2 of their cousins became Elvis's grandparents. Bob and son and Doll, White's daughter, got married in 1903. This was not the only time cousins married in their family or in Mississippi at that time. It was more common in the South and rural areas. People didn't know the risks of marrying cousins like we do now. Even famous musicians like Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin in the 1950s, which caused a lot of trouble, but he said it was normal in the South back then. Just like rich families in the North and the South used to marry their cousins to keep their wealth in the family, poor sharecroppers also married because of their situation. They had very little money and it was hard to escape their poverty. Sometimes they had to wait years to get officially married even if they were living together, just because they couldn't afford the small cost of a marriage license. Some people said that sharecropping helped poor people have food and a place to live. But in reality, sharecropping was a bad system that kept people in a cycle of hard work and poverty. Many poor white people, not just black people, had to pick cotton in the first half of the 1900s. It was a tough time for people in rural Mississippi, and Elvis's family, as well as the families of Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Sam Phillips, knew this struggle. Being a sharecropper was very hard, and it's hard for us today to understand how tough it was. They worked really hard every day, and their homes were simple and not very comfortable. They mostly ate salt pork, cornmeal, and flour, which wasn't. Elvis's grandparents on his mom's side, Bob and Doll Smith, got married in 1903. Doll was very pretty but also flirty. Bob was a good man who was loyal to his wife and family. They moved in with Bob's mom after getting married, and they had to keep moving to different farms because they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They worked on at least 7 farms within a 10-mile area. Bob worked very hard, even walking 7 miles each day to a winter job digging a ditch. But despite his efforts, they still struggled to make ends meet. Things were already tough for Bob, who was the head of the family, and then their first child, a girl named Effie, was born in 1904. Sadly, Effie only lived for a year and a half. After Effie's birth, Doll, the mother, got very sick with a serious disease called tuberculosis. She had to stay in bed for the next 30 years and rarely left. Tuberculosis was a very dangerous disease back then. Many people died from it, and it was one of the most common causes of death in the 1800s. Even though more was understood about the disease by the 1900s, it was still a big problem. It was the 3rd leading cause of death, and it killed around 110,000 Americans every year. People called it many names like phthisis, consumption, and the graveyard cough. It made it hard for people to breathe, caused coughing and fever, and made them very weak. A long time ago, a disease called tuberculosis (TB) was very dangerous, and most people who got it died within 5 years. Doll, from Elvis's family, had this disease but lived with it for over 30 years, which was very unusual. TB spreads like a cold, when someone sneezes, coughs, or spits. But in Doll's small house with many people, only she got sick. Some people wonder if she really had TB or if it was another sickness that wasn't known at the time. In the late 1800s, doctors found out about the bacteria that causes TB and how to use X-rays to see if someone has it. But in 1904, when Doll got sick, these tools might not have been available for a poor sharecropper's wife in Mississippi. So, it's possible that Doll was just one of the lucky people who lived a long time with a very serious disease. Maybe we can learn something from Doll's illness. Doll was likely suffering from a genetic disease called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. This disease is passed from parents to children through genes. Elvis's autopsy showed that he was a carrier of this disorder. Alpha-1 can affect the lungs and liver. It's often hard to diagnose and can take a long time and many doctors to figure out. This disease might be why Elvis and some of his family members, like Gladys, didn't live as long as they should have.